Joe, please welcome our special guest.
She's special indeed. um, I'd like to note that the term 6 degrees of separation has extra meaning for Alphecca's present. We've had guests in the past on German public banking. We've had Ellen Brown on one public bank that has succeeded. We've had Professor Ronnie Phillips talk about the Chicago Plan, and in his presentation, he talked about Reconstruction Finance Corporation. If we search on that, it takes us to the Emmy Award-winning Stephen Fenberg on the RFC and Jesse Jones, its operator. And following Stephen, it takes us to his presentations on the national infrastructure. So there are many paths learning about the bank. And I would say that I think the NIB is a cousin. They have a great team of experts like we do, including herself and Robert Hockett, who will also present today. She has a great team of activists like we do. And they want legislation to realize their vision like we do. So we have a lot in common. So Alphecca, if the floor is yours, please begin.
Thank you very much to all of you. This is my first time presenting at American Monetary Institute, so I'm learning a lot listening to the other speakers. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my background before I start talking. I worked for 25 years at the International Monetary Fund on country desk work where we were trying to rationalize their overall government finances so that they could begin to get their economies back on a growth path and stabilized. And a lot of the work that I did there was both across the monetary sphere and the fiscal sphere and the real economy all together. So when I look at these things, how to get back on a sustainable path, I think that we have to look at all the four sectors together. And that's very much where I'm coming from with the work that I've done on the National Infrastructure Bank. So I joined a coalition after I retired from the IMF, but then I got myself unretired. So I joined this coalition for a national infrastructure bank, and we've been working on a bill in Congress over the last 5 years or so to get a public bank enacted. And I want to tell you something about this, how this bank works in today's economy, what the historical context is, the big backdrop, the big picture that in the United States we have now huge income inequality. We have in what is, in my view, a monetary policy that's kind of run amok. And now they're trying to they were very too much permissive for a long period of time and to satisfy the banking community. But then when inflation popped up, they're trying to hammer it down like whack-a-mole, and it's not working too well, and they're destabilizing banks and a whole lot of other things. And then in addition, we have this structural budget deficit and a recession coming our way. So we have a bill in Congress. I want to tell you about that, a legislation to create a $5 trillion national infrastructure bank. I want to describe how it works. I want to describe how targeted credit under this national infrastructure bank will accelerate economic growth in the country, but more importantly, equitable economic growth. And that this legislation has a lot of momentum. We have a big, huge grassroots campaign. This legislation is actually passable. So to look at the big picture, this is a bank to finance infrastructure. The big picture is that over time, since the last time we had a bank like this, which ended its operations in 1957, the only infrastructure thrust that we've pushed forward has been the Highway Trust Fund under Eisenhower, started by Eisenhower. And that earmarked money from a gas tax to direct it just at road construction. And there was a big economic push that came out, acceleration that came out of investing in that kind of infrastructure. But over time, infrastructure in the federal budget has gotten squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And in today's world, we're spending very much less as a percent of our GDP on infrastructure, the United States only a few percentage points compared to China, which spends 3 times or 4 times more than we do, 10 times more, depending on the data point that you pick out. And Europe also spends much more than we do. And so we're falling behind competitively. That's the long run picture. And then the short run picture is that we have right now a budget crisis. We're just watching the news within the last hour. The government has decided not to shut down. The House passed a continuing resolution to keep it open. We'll see. Midnight was the drop dead time for passing this legislation. We'll see if that comes about or not. But in the main, we have a big, huge fight over our budget deficit and our national debt. And what we know is that our national debt is now at $33 trillion. We spent $5 trillion of that over the last 2 years to get us out of the COVID recession. In addition to that, giving money to people in terms of stimulus checks, giving money to small businesses to keep paying their workers, and even giving money to states and local governments. Some of it they spent on infrastructure, others they just gave away tax breaks to the wealthy corporations that don't need it. The question is how we formulate our budget so that we can reinvest in our country. After the downturn, the COVID downturn, we passed several bills. One was the bipartisan infrastructure law that was aiming at topping up or expanding spending on infrastructure. That bill it made a new push, but it didn't go quite far enough. So it started out at $3 trillion. And then when senators said, well, how are we going to pay for it? Oh, we'd have to raise taxes. Oh, well, we don't want to do that. It got smaller and smaller and smaller. And so now what that bill over a 5-year period is going to provide is only $550 billion of new additional money. And to fix our infrastructure, which we haven't fixed in the last 70 years, we need a lot more money than that. And that's why our National Infrastructure Bank tries to define how much money do we need, how much extra money do we need. That bank will provide it, and it'll act as a workaround to the budget to finance infrastructure, direct it, and all without any need for new spending, taxes, or deficits on the federal budget. If we slip into a recession, which I'll come onto the next slide, we can also use this National Infrastructure Bank to hire up people that are put out of work and hire them up into these great paying jobs. And it'll rationalize markets that are in problems right now, including our housing market, where we have lots and lots of people becoming unhoused, homeless, or housing insecure. Our food prices, which are really impacting a lot of folks, these are 2 big sources of instability. We want to direct optimal investment to grow our economy faster, maybe 2 times faster than in what it has been historically, raise our productivity, and create millions of new permanent, great paying jobs for everyone. So that's the idea. In addition to that, we look like we're heading into a recession. Here's a graph of the Conference Board's leading economic indicators, which put together like 10 different indicators. Manufacturing output, housing starts, bank credit, that kind of thing. And what you can see is that over the last 17 months, it has really been tanking downwards. And whenever it turns and goes downward, we have a recession. That's what these gray bands are right here that you can see after every one. So it's long, according to this indicator, recession is long overdue. We still have continuing inflation, which is still popping back up again. As long as we have that, the Federal Reserve will probably continue to raise interest rates. When they do that, that makes and quantitative tightening on the supply of the money. When all that happens, pushes the economy downward, puts people out of work. In addition to that, we have a tight labor market. Even though we have a tight labor market with low unemployment, we still have very high income inequality. We just have recently now an ongoing strike with the United Auto Workers, and the head of that union has repeatedly stated that, look, CEO pay for the last 2 years rose 40%. Profits of those companies rose 40%. and the worker pay only rose 8% over the same period. So workers are not catching up. We don't have equitable pay for the contributions that workers are making. And banks are sliding further into a crisis. The banking world is upside down because the Fed raised rates. Deposits are fleeing out of banks, and that's caused bank closures, and some of them having gone onto receivership. And the rating agencies have downgraded all the banks. In addition to that, they're holding a lot of really shaky real estate, commercial real estate, that could really topple banks if pressure keeps getting put on the banks. If we have a banking crisis on top of an economic recession, that recession will be made ever so much worse. So now economists are saying that we could start a recession early next year. The idea of a national infrastructure bank is that we can lean against any recession and put people to work into great paying jobs. This idea of a public bank to do these kinds of things is not a new idea. Lots of folks have been talking about during this conference have been talking about how we use sovereign money for the public good. But these banks did essentially the same thing. There were 4 of them. They all used sort of essentially the same principle. The very first one was the first Bank of the United States, started by Alexander Hamilton. It was a situation very much like today, with high debt as a result of the Revolutionary War, no banking system in place, and we had only a commandment of enhancing the public good through the Constitution. So what Hamilton did was to repurpose existing debt from the American Revolutionary War as a means to capitalize the bank, and then gave out loans to build infrastructure and create manufacturing, our first manufacturing sites in the country. Second Bank of the United States did the same thing after we nearly lost the War of 1812 to the British. All of these were political fights when their 20-year time limit ran out, and we kept needing to have new banks reinstituted. Lincoln ran on the platform of a third bank. It didn't happen. And then he had a banking crisis also. So he instituted the National Banking Act in 1883 and 83 and 84, I think. Did the same process of using existing treasuries to capitalize these newly created banks. Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Everybody knows about the New Deal, but they don't know the critical role that this huge financial institution played in financing everything and building big ticket projects like Hoover Dam, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, like electrifying all of rural America when it didn't have electricity. So there's great precedent. These banks were very successful, and that's why we need a 5th bank. So here is the legislation that we have in place, H.R. 4052. What this bill will do is create a $5 trillion public bank to lend for infrastructure projects all across the country. And again, why do we need one? Because private capital markets, existing budgets, whether it's federal, state, or local, have not been able to adequately finance infrastructure. They don't have the capacity, and they're not directing it in those places. So this National Infrastructure Bank will take over, complement all those budgets and other sources of financing to top up and build everything. We currently on the bill have 15 co-sponsors, including the main sponsor. Our grassroots campaign, the bill was just reintroduced in mid-June. Our grassroots campaign is actively seeking members of Congress to come on board and increase the number of co-sponsors. And anyone in your consortium who would like to help with that, we would love to have you join our coalition. Our webpage was up on the first slide, nibcoalition.com. And you can just send us an email at info@nibcoalition.com, and we'll add you onto our list of active members working to get this legislation passed. And by the way, I'll come back to that in just a sec. So this is a description of how the NIB works. It is kind of like an intermediary between the kind of big ideas you've been talking about on monetary reform and actually doing a specific cut at getting an institution that will rationalize the budget, rationalize where we create money and direct it at a specific area. This bill creates a financial institution, a government-owned financial institution under the Government Corporations Act. And this bank actually operates the same as any commercial bank. So to do that, the first step we need to do to open a bank like this is to get it adequately capitalized. Instead of going to the budget and asking for money to do that, which is not going to happen in today's contractionary budget, debates. Instead, we go to the private sector, who are holding about $26 trillion in treasuries, and we ask would they like to sell in a small portion of them into the NIB in exchange for an equivalent of preferred stock that would pay investors a little extra. That's the enticement for them to sell in. And that 2% stream of money would come out of interest earnings from the NIB's loans, with plenty of money left over to meet other operational needs. Just this bank, just like all other commercial banks, lives off the difference between the interest it charges on its loans and what it has to pay to depositors and bondholders to bring in cash into the bank to circulate it around. So that will be there will be plenty of money in its operations to do that. That means the bank is self-sufficient, self-sustaining, doesn't require infusions from the budget to subsidize its operations over time. And then the capital sits on the bank's books, like all good banks, which would maintain $1 in capital for every $10 in loans they give out. As we give out the loans over a period of years, we can raise this capital over the same period to maintain the 1-to-10 ratio. So that's how the bank is capitalized. It's the Alexander Hamilton method of capitalization. And this explains how the NIB gives out a loan, which again works exactly the same as any commercial bank. Each time the NIB books and creates a loan, its software automatically opens a deposit on the other side. Whenever you create a new deposit, you're adding to the money supply. And then the NIB uses cash on hand coming in from deposits and loan repayments through the fractional reserve, same process that all commercial banks use to circulate money out of the new deposit into the rest of the banking system. So that's the loan process. The loan terms are very advantageous around the Treasury bond rate for interest charged and flexible repayment terms. And then borrowers would be state and local governments. So not only are we directing infrastructure financing into infrastructure, but we're directing it to the target that we really want to reach, which is the owners of public infrastructure, that is counties or cities that own a road, a bridge, a school. They can come in directly to the NIB to request a loan. And these are very low cost loans too, by the way, since this is a public bank, a nonprofit maximizing bank, and we want to keep loan costs down to a bare minimum. We cover $5 trillion in projects, as I mentioned, in 20 infrastructure categories. 16 of those categories are routinely monitored by the American Society of Civil Engineers, who every few years comes up with a report card saying, how much money do we need to actually repair all of our backlog of transportation systems, water systems, and the electric power grid? All of that's covered by the NIB. And then in addition, we added 4 more categories we also think are critical. A complete high-speed rail network all across the country. I'll come back to that in a minute. Broadband everywhere. Affordable housing, 7 million units targeted to the very lowest income earners who need them the most, because this sector is really in a crisis right now. And then some large-scale water projects to address drought in the Southwest, where we grow half of our nation's food supply. So not only can we fix all of our infrastructure using a bank like this, but we can really supercharge the American economy. First of all, this kind of construction activity will directly and indirectly create up to 25 million new great paying jobs. The Buy America Only provisions of the bill, I forgot to mention that those great paying jobs require, according to the legislation, that workers be paid high prevailing or Davis-Bacon wages. And that will put much, much more money into people's pockets, provide them with family-sustaining wage jobs, not having to work at Walmart for two or 3 jobs just to get by, and still not having enough money in their pockets to pay for rent, food, daycare, or medicine. This will help them to have a family-sustaining wage job. And then Buy America Only, another requirement of the bill for the construction inputs, means we can reshore American manufacturing. All our steel, all our cement would be made here in the United States. All our rail cars, our wind turbines. We could reopen factories in Pennsylvania, in Ohio that have been closed, and make all these construction inputs here, which will create even more jobs. And then we can get our GDP growth, as I mentioned, up to at least twice what it has been historically. A lot of this modeling for all the numbers of jobs and what it would do to the different sectors came out of a University of Maryland model. It's an input-output model. It was used for the most recent American Society of Civil Engineers report card on what would be the effects of every dollar that you spent on a new bridge or a new road. What would that plow back into the economy, and how would it affect all the different sectors? That's where all this comes from. And in addition, that was also the history of what happened with the most previous bank, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, that also doubled economic growth to 5% a year. So keep in mind, all of this is a workaround. It requires no new federal taxes, spending, or deficits. It should appeal to Republicans, fiscal conservatives, means the bill has got a great chance of actually getting passed. And it'll reduce inflation, works on the supply side of goods, brings their prices down, gets them to market on time, and it'll offset any coming recession, because anybody that becomes unemployed as a result of that, we can hire them up into these great paying jobs. So just to show you how the sector input can really supercharge economic growth, here is a map of where we might place some of the high-speed rail network. This map was developed by an economist who built systems in the UK, and he's done a cost-benefit analysis on traffic patterns and all that other kind of thing across the United States. And all of these routes would be self-sustaining, high-speed rail self-sustaining. They would bring down climate change costs because it uses much less energy to move a high-speed rail train than it is to drive a truck or a car or even fly an airplane. So it saves a lot on fuel. It's also cost-effective. A study by the Washington Department of Transportation to build this one leg of the system right here called Cascadia Rail, they found that it's much cheaper to build the high-speed rail than it is to widen the highway, and it'll save much more on fuel costs as well. Also, to save on traffic congestion, we're wasting a lot of fuel sitting in traffic around the United States with the CO2 going up into the air. So the big push of the bank is to put much more rail into the transportation mix. And we also have before and after satellites of what happened in China when they built these kinds of they built 22,000 miles of high-speed rail lines in their country to move workers back and forth to production centers. And their growth rate just skyrocketed. And you can see, as I said, the before and after satellite pictures. They use, how do they finance all that? They have 3 development banks like this to finance their infrastructure. So that's one area that we would concentrate on. Solving homelessness is another problem. 40% maybe of our workforce, our low-income earners, are housing insecure. They can't afford to pay rent, as I said, and daycare and medicine. And lately, the cost of renting has really skyrocketed in many cities, Los Angeles, New York. And none of this will be addressed by the bills that have passed in Congress so far. We must stabilize our power grid. It is now very vulnerable to weather events, cyber attacks, and peak demand problems. We've seen with alarming, scariness what happened to Maui when half the island burnt down because the power lines were not covered with insulation. The power poles were weak. All of this was known for years in advance, and that power company did not make the investments or was not provided with the resources to make the investments to protect against such a thing. And with that absolutely must change. In addition, the power grid is not ready for electric vehicles. It is maxed out on in summertime with climate change and heat, and all of this needs to be worked on. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is really the climate bill, has money in it for new generation, but not for rebuilding the grid. And that's where this bank will take over. We must do more on our water infrastructure. We're still poisoning children across the country, especially in these northeastern central states with lead service lines. There's very little money in the Inflation Reduction, in the bipartisan infrastructure law for lead pipes, and we have to fix all of those. Another speaker talked about the flooding in New York. That's been persistent problems now that we have climate change that holds much more rain in the atmosphere. We have deluges of water that are flooding out places. And it could happen here. It could destroy dams. It has already happened and even drown people in their own basement apartments. All of this needs to be worked on, and there's money in the bank in the bill for that. Rural areas are suffering economically. They're declining. Populations are leaving. In addition to that, the way the bank addresses this is to work on water infrastructure and water management, connect rural area with high-speed rail and better telecommunications, and then work on this whole area right here in the Southwest where we grow our nation's food. This food up here is really soybeans and corn is really animal feed, but all of this area down here has been subject to a 1,000-year drought. The Colorado River is drying up, even though we had good rainfall last winter. It's just drying up, and the water tables are depleting at an astronomical rate. If that continues to happen without any government intervention to see water as a public resource, then we will have much more decline in our food production, and that will have much more run up. We will become food insecure, as strangely as that is to think about. And some of the projects the bank will work on, it has $400 billion in there just for water management. One scheme is to bring water up that's not being used right now from Louisiana and refill the Colorado River, which serves 7 states and 40 million people, to get that back on its feet again, and then also work on the water tables as well. We want to help low-income communities. All of this is baked into the bill. So it's not only directing, but it's making sure that we have equitable growth coming out of this, fair access to these great paying jobs by minorities, getting jobs into disadvantaged business enterprises. We use several bits of legislation and ideas from Jim Clyburn to others to make sure that we get money into tribal areas and inner city areas and rural areas, and we help them with these great family sustaining jobs. So, and finally, there is a component of the bill, even though this is predominantly an infrastructure bill, there is a component of the bill to tackle climate change through several means. First is to work on the transportation sector, get more rail into the mix and get cars off the road. The second one is to work on the electricity sector to get more transmission. Right now, we're bringing on new solar and wind turbines, but we have no place to plug them in. And there's a backlog of all these generators that are trying to get onto the grid, and they can't get onto the grid right now. Plus, if we want to build out high-speed rail and electrify, for example, all of our freight rail fleet, then we're going to need even more electric capacity. So all of these are things that the bank will be working on, and each individual project will have a climate mitigation component to it to see if we can reduce use of fossil fuels. So in summary, I would say that this is an independent public corporation. It is mixed ownership. Its charter can direct financing to where we need it. Once it's enacted, it has a board of directors that decides on the loans. Once it's enacted, it goes off and works on its own. It doesn't need to come back to Congress with any cycle or new party that's in favor and who has a difference of opinion on what we passed last time, as is the case right now. It'll operate like a commercial bank, so it'll use all the same mechanisms that are in place for a commercial bank right now. It has bank rules to ensure repayment of all these loans. An example of how well that worked was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that lent out billions of dollars and had not a whiff of complaint on the loans. and built really complicated projects. The Tennessee Valley Authority is like a work of masterpiece, really, if you study how that was built. And all these projects can be built with a national infrastructure bank today. Our grassroots campaign is very, very active in getting more support for this bill. And the way that we found that it works really well is to have lots of education and meetings with state legislators. Ask them, would they like to put in a resolution in their state legislature supporting the bank? And then once we get a bunch of them, we've already passed them introduced them in 25 state legislatures, passed them in 8, at least in one chamber. We have a whole lot of cities, Detroit, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Philly, Pittsburgh, and Seattle, just was the last one that came on board, which have endorsed this proposal because they recognize that they need it to complete and top up the infrastructure in their cities and do great urban planning and build things out in a comprehensive and great way where we can put public housing next to transit stations and get people back and forth to work with as little fuss as possible, but dig up the roads only once, fix up all the piping and everything underneath the roads, and then fix those potholed roads like they have so many of them in Michigan and Washington State. And when we point out the direct benefit to them, then they come on board as supporters of the bank, and they go to their members of Congress and they convince their members of Congress to sign on to the bill. So that's been our plan, and it's working well. And we have a lot of momentum out of this bill. We think that it's really passable. So I'll stop there. See if you have any questions.
Can you leave your slides up actually and go back to the one about ownership? I think that will have most of the intriguing questions from this crowd. Thank you.
All right.
That was terrific, Alphecca. Really inspiring. I think you can all see why Ronnie Phillips promoted the RFC and why he has his very own copy of the book by Jesse Jones, who operated the RFC from about 1932 to 45, something in that neighborhood. That was terrific. There are other academics who are promoting your ideas. Professor Mariana Mazzucato has pointed out that sovereign infrastructure institutes around the world have more funds than all the private sector institutes, and yet the United States doesn't have one, and certainly should have. We, the people, have been fighting for monetary reform and amendments to the Constitution and so forth. But clearly, this is another arrow that we, the people, should add to our quiver. It's an amazing concept. You've pointed out, is as proof of concept. It's worked historically several times, working in other places in the world. It's something everybody should be. All social justice advocates and organizations should support. In listening to many of our guests today, including you, I'm reminded of the tragedy of the enclosure of the Commons in England centuries ago. What we've been fighting in AMI is the enclosure of the money creation system. Your group is fighting the enclosure of banking. And your strategy is brilliant. You're fighting fire with fire. You're using the fractional reserve system, like the change, for the benefit of the public instead of the benefit of shareholders. So it's just it's an inspirational program. And I did put earlier a presentation by Stephen Fenberg on the RFC, and I would encourage people to find him and watch him. It's an amazing story that occurred during that time. And I think the RFC was the largest single economic entity in the United States during that period, bigger than any one firm. So there are questions, I'm sure. I will mention one off the top. Mark Pash asked a really good question, which I believe has been answered previously in some of the presentations I saw. He's asking if you're reaching out to Republican sources, and if you could please answer that question. Try to be bipartisan, I guess.
Yeah, we were ready to reintroduce the bill in January when the current session started. But the sponsor, Danny Davis, really wanted to have some Republicans on board. So we spent 6 months trying to lobby them and to convince them that this would really be good for their districts. They are much of the mind. They agreed. Infrastructure is easily a bipartisan issue. They all know that they need it. The problem was they didn't like the optics of signing on to a $5 trillion bill, even though it cost the budget nothing. It just doesn't look good when they're fighting against big government and they want to cut on the budget. But we are, as a result of that, Congressman Davis decided to go ahead and issue the legislation in mid-June. And he put up a video on our website explaining his thinking, saying, okay, we're not going to wait any longer. I mean, the situation is becoming dire. And we really need to get, up and running. If it's just going to be Democratic for now, then so be it. We're still continuing to approach Republicans. We think that my personal view is that if we slip into a recession, if it goes badly wrong, keep in mind there is no way to finance our way out of a deficit like we did, to finance our way out of a recession like we did in 2008 and in 2020. We always added on to the debt that way. Our debt is so high right now. I doubt that they would do stimulus spending out of the budget. And I doubt that the Fed will do expansionist monetary policy to get us out either, because they're busy still fighting inflation. They're just like this. And so this would be the only plan B. And that was exactly the case during the Great Depression, when the budget couldn't afford to do stimulus spending. All the banks were closed, and there was only this Reconstruction Finance Corporation sitting around, which FDR repurposed. It was left over from Herbert Hoover. And it did become, as you said, it was called it was huge. It was called the fourth arm of government. It was larger than the entire size of the federal budget. It was larger than all the commercial banks combined before they closed. And it built these big ticket items, and that put so many people back to work. And it helped to mobilize us up for World War II, rebuilt all of the tool die industry, and all of that seamlessly converted over from making airplanes and tanks to making washing machines and other things after the war ended. It was a beautiful concept, worked so well, and we need another one like that today. We need a permanent bank, because we can't have all these cycles. Infrastructure needs a long-term source of financing for it to be really productive, and for us to train up our workers in these great paying jobs as well. So
Thanks
Republicans we're still going after Republicans. If we go into a recession, we'll see if they come on board.
I certainly hope you win that battle. All right, we have two people with hands up. We'll start with Ronnie Phillips, since I've mentioned him a few times. And Ronnie, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. Joe, not only do I have, I don't know, can you see this? Not only do I have Jesse Jones' book, I actually have an autographed copy. It's, of course, not autographed to me, but I certainly enjoyed your talk. And the Reconstruction Finance Corporation is something that people need to know more. The average person needs to know more about the history, and we really need to bring that idea back. As you said, it was Herbert Hoover who started the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. But remember, that was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was modeled after the War Finance Corporation, which helped finance World War I. So it's a long history, and it's something we need to bring back. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Phillips. John Howell, I don't think we've heard from you today, so we'll put you ahead of Carol, but Carol, you're on the list. Go ahead, John.
Okay, well, thanks very much for this very clear presentation. However, I have a lot of problems with it. What I understand is this national infrastructure. I'm sorry, I didn't have my there. Okay, now I'm there. So the National Infrastructure Bank is going to loan to my city for a water project or something else. So my city now has to pay that loan back over time. It postpones payment, to successive generations. But my city is going to have to pay for that. And it depends on my city's ability to grow in order to generate the kind of taxes that will be dependent on good salaries. But that growth is a problem. We are already pushing the limits of a finite planet. Rayworth has described this very eloquently in The Donut Economics. This seems just like a plan that will explode the limits of the limits that we live with on the planet. I don't see how you can do this. I agree with the need for appropriate public expenditures. I don't think you can do this without cutting some of the wasteful expenditures in other parts of the economy. And that's what monetary reform is about, is to shift, essentially, money and the creation of money to go for public purposes. And in part, what you have described is consistent with that. But it's incomplete because it leaves us with this problem of solving the problem by growth, by solving the problem of getting into debt further by any community, just like the International Monetary Fund has done with developing countries, and they're struggling enormously. So I'm not quite sure that I follow this as a great solution. I understand the rationale for wanting to do this, so I'm with you on that. But I have problems with the big picture here.
Well, I would say that the big picture is if we do nothing, if we just kick the can down the road on our crumbling infrastructure, we have more places burned down like Maui did, we have more dams burst like happened in North Africa, we sit on clogged roads with traffic congestion, our growth will go backwards anyway. That's the first thing. The second thing is this kind of investment, which is the best kind of investment, does direct to the best investments that you can make. Whether we have fiscal reform, and that would include things like rationalizing defense spending. Come on, we spend more on defense than just any other item in the budget, except for maybe Medicare. And that defense spending hasn't even ever passed an audit. They were giving out suitcases of money in Afghanistan over a 20-year period. So all of that is another an argumentation for another day. I think of defense spending as non-productive spending. This improves the productivity of our economy. Not only do trucks move faster, that kind of thing, but you can produce more with less inputs. That's what a productivity measure is. If you look at graphs of how productivity rose through the investments of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, it was phenomenal. It went from 0 to 3.5% a year. When you have that kind of improvement in productivity, then you're producing much more for much less inputs. That's the second point. The third point is about who we're lending to and their ability to repay. The secret sauce really is that this will generate growth. I mean, that model that I referred to of the University of Maryland, they have, and on their engineering side, they have a lot of measures of elasticity. For every dollar that you invest in roads, then it plows back $3 back into the economy, that kind of thing. With the higher growth, then you're able to capture more revenues at the state and local level to pay back the loans. And you can think of it really in terms of, in real estate, here's and I have a slide on this. You can really think of it in terms of, I went past it. You could think really in terms of if you want to look just at the borrower's financial capacity to borrow, okay, say we would look at a county or a state. These are the revenues of the county, the states in blue, and the counties in orange. And what we know is that they cycle up and down according to economic growth, especially the state revenues. They go down when we have a depression, they go recession, they go back up again when we have a recovery. This is the stimulus, the very unusual stimulus money that was given to them as a result of COVID. That money is going away now. So their revenues will be coming down anyway, just because of fiscal contraction in that area. But it is the secret sauce here is that we really will generate new economic growth. And you have, again, to look no further than the Reconstruction Finance Corporation when it lent into really poor areas like rural America, 80% of which had no electricity. And everybody said, oh, you can't lend to them. They can't pay you back. And indeed, the productivity of their farms from getting them electrified, they actually helped the farmers to buy new equipment, water pumps and clothes washers and things, cow milk machines and that kind of thing. All of that increased the productivity of the farm so much that all of those loans were paid back, and many of those cooperative electric organizations are still in place today. So this is a proven model. When we have new revenue coming in, every 9 cents of that new dollar will be captured by these state and local governments to pay back the loans. Then finally, there is technological advances, which I didn't discuss yet, but you can really see how this is another way to have growth with less inputs. So we're not bumping up against the limits of what we can grow. An example is we're going to need a lot of steel and a lot of cement to make all these infrastructure improvements. I talked to a steel plant in Pueblo, Colorado, that is located right on the freight track line and is producing a stick rail for rail replacements using arc welding from recycled cars, where the source of energy is renewable solar power. So you can't get any better than that. I mean, that's a technological improvement that just shows you how you can, it's not the old legacy steel plant where you needed coal and you needed, lots of belching CO2 and that kind of thing into the air. Another area is rebuilding and rebalancing the electric grid. Now we're not going to have just a transmission line from a centralized nuclear power plant or a coal plant going to a town. Now we're going to have a whole finer grid of connections all across the country where we can move power from a cornfield, from a wind turbine in a cornfield in Oklahoma to a household in Atlanta, Georgia, and capture the benefits of the sun. Same thing for electric cars. So all of these things with new technologies, we can reduce our use of fossil fuels. We can balance, we can bring our economy much more productive, and we can even apply, like robotics to growing new ways of growing food. And by the way, I didn't bring up the agricultural sector because I really think that we need to do, agriculture contributes some 15% of global emissions. It's not done well at all currently. Even when you plow in these big mega farm cornfields and things like that, you're just putting more CO2 up into the air. We can have a different, more sustainable way that we grow our food. We can grow with less inputs. My daughter works at the greenhouses in Holland, where they grow everything hydroponically, and they produce more food per square inch per square foot than any place in the world, and they ship it all over all over Europe. So there's lots and lots of things that we can do on the technology side and on the economic growth side. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Donna. I think you can see why she had such a great career at the IMF.
Let me just say one thing, Joe. I do appreciate the response to my question, and I really appreciate the fact what you pointed out, that we need fiscal readjustments in terms of deciding where we spend our money nationally. That's part of the problem too. And I would just like to point out that this problem has multiple features. And just like monetary reform is not a magic solution for everything, neither is this a magic solution for everything. And I appreciate your comment on the need for fiscal things as well. You do have more faith in technology than I do in terms of addressing the problem of CO2 emission. And there is a big discussion about this, but there's no sense in doing that now. But thanks again for your presentation.
Thanks, John. I'm going to backtrack a bit. I'm going to follow Steve's point of getting the new people in first. So Professor Winnick is there, and he's a great advocate at the NIB, and he's made some great comments about the the advantages of high-speed trains and so forth, and all sorts of ideas. So I'll give him a chance first. Go ahead, Professor Winnick.
Thank you very much. Yeah, full disclosure, I've been working closely with the Coalition for the National Infrastructure Bank for about a month now, and so I'm certainly not unbiased. I'm also a monetary theorist, and I'm a supporter of the modern monetary theory and the reform of the currency system. I absolutely agree with that, but these are not alternatives. It's not a one or the other. Key thing is, if we can get it through Congress, the National Infrastructure Bank becomes a reality within the next year. Reform of the monetary system, the way things are going, and given the legal structure, is going to take us a decade, if we're lucky. And meanwhile, it isn't just a question of climate change, although I'll get to that. It's other questions. Our children are dying of lead poisoning around the country. We either keep killing our children or we replace these pipes. That's very expensive. I live in the LA area. This is the largest port from imports from Asia. The lines of trucks leaving Long Beach and San Francisco and LA Harbor, all the way to Chicago and what have you, is insane. It's simply insane. I don't care whether those are electric trucks or things. You're moving this stuff at 70, 80 miles an hour if you're lucky. For now, using massive amounts of fuel and what have you, when we could be moving it at 200 miles an hour efficiently with electricity that's generated renewably. We have a situation where there are 7 states dependent on the Colorado River. The Colorado River is drying up. No question about it. The seismologists and climatologists, we know where that's going. We either create an aqueduct to move water back and recharge the Colorado River, or our agricultural system in those 7 states collapses and we can all go looking for food. It's not an alternative. We either fix it or we don't eat. That's real, right? The question of the grid, aside from what Alphecca already mentioned, right now we lose 30% of all the electricity we generate because of the nature of our grid. That's insane. That's simply insane. We could produce with wind energy up the Mississippi River enough electricity to support everything from the East Coast to the Rocky Mountains. But we have no mountains. We have no wires that run that way. We can't move it. There's no electric grid system to move it. And if we use parts of the system we have, all we do is start forest fires. I could go on and on and on. On the high-speed rail system, I just want to make a point. I can travel from Lisbon, Portugal, to Prague in the Czech Republic. I can travel Naples, Italy, to Edinburgh, Scotland by high-speed rail. I can travel all over China, all over South Korea, all over Japan, all with high-speed rail. And how much diesel does it use? None. All of these systems are electric. Here in California, we've been trying for 10 years to build a high-speed rail system from San Francisco to LA, and we haven't got one foot of moving train yet. How does the rest of the world do this? With infrastructure banks. They're not stupid. China's got 3 infrastructure banks. South Korea has an infrastructure bank. Japan has an infrastructure bank. Germany has a whole network of infrastructure banks and public banks. I mean, this is being used around the world, and we're sitting here like we can't find a way to do this stuff. That's insane. I made a comment to some others recently. When I was teaching, I'm retired now, sort of. Anyhow, when I was teaching, one of the comments I'd have to make to my students at the beginning of most classes was, you have to understand that you have been inculcated with a false ideology. You're believing something that's not true. And it's the fact that you've been told that no matter how bad it is in America, it's better than every place else. And that's simply not true. That's a lie. That's not true. Our health system is not better. Our educational system is not better. Our transportation system is not better. Our housing system is not better. It's not true. And if we don't do something to fix all of this, we will become a third world country for all practical purposes. There really is no alternative. If anyone has an alternative that can do all this, I think they would have found it by now. And this is just something that has to happen, or we are in trouble, and not just trouble in a growth sense, but trouble, as I said, killing our children, all the rest of it. And I'll stop with that. I could go on, but it's probably not appropriate.
Joe, you're muted.
Joe, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks again, Andy. As I said, we're like cousins. We rely on terrific academics, and you and Alphecca demonstrate that. You have yours as well. And it turns out we share one. We have Robert Hawkins just arrived, and he's presented very well for you folks as well. Lucille, you had your hand up, and you haven't had a chance to speak today, so I'm going to let you go first, if you're there.
Sure, I'm here. I gave up on speaking already. So I was trying to write something in the chat instead, but I appreciate your presentation. I will try to be very brief. I have just a couple comments and then 3 questions, so you won't have time for them all, but we share very much all the concerns of the destructive consequences of our existing economy and money system that you laid out. And what your presentation and your energy in arguing for it makes it sound too good to be true. And I know you believe it is true. And with all due respect, I've also been working on the money question for quite a while, over few decades. I also have experience internationally in third world countries, working on the ground in Botswana in a subsistence farming community, smaller than a village. Studied economics, studied African studies, and did a doctorate on value in economics, ethics, and education. So I worked then in the field of education. My question about, given that background of my own, with all due respect, I do believe what you've said is too good to be true. And I also believe, like I was going to put in the chat, that it will pass. This bill will pass because sooner or later, and I think sooner, because it is very system imminent. It is at a time when the US dollar internationally is under threat, that dominance, and that threat did its dirty work in commerce in the United States before it went international. That's another story. But I want my goal in the end is to see, are there ways we can partner with, because I do think our proposals is another plan B. And so are there ways we can figure it out? And my third question was going to be, to what extent have you read the literature that is represented in the other speakers in this conference? But my prior 2 questions would be that it seems like this is system imminent, and the same beneficiaries of the existing system nationally and globally will continue to benefit from them. And all it's doing is making it serve in the public interest, and that we share, we want that, but not based on private interest-bearing debt-based money. That's the flaw we want to change and have wholly public sovereign money, not public sovereign debt, interest-bearing debt. And that was John's question. And so to me, what you're doing is really an example of Einstein's definition of insanity, which is, doing for the fifth time, a fifth national bank, so-called public bank that is bank serving, private commercial bank serving, but not serving the sustainable long-term interests, not of today's politicians, but of multiple generations, our great-great-great-grandchildren. So I appreciate you being here, accepting the invitation. I would like to know what you've read of Zarlenga and Huber and even Kumhof and other presenters. And I would like to find common ground because I don't want to be your competitor.
I don't see us as competitors at all. Govert had sent me, when he first invited me to make this presentation, he sent me a really nice synopsis of what AMI stands for and all the papers on the bottom of it, with nice explanations, including Bob Hockett's paper, so I've got them all in a list. I've always thought that we need monetary reform. I think the Federal Reserve is breaking things all over the place right now. They're breaking the banking system. They're breaking the job. It's bad. So I think there's lots of room for overlap. One of the things that'll be a challenge for the NIB is to make sure that it's adequately, but I don't think the capitalization will be a challenge. There's plenty of treasuries out there that we can use to capitalize, but getting if we're going to work through the money multiplier and the deposit system, we're going to need to attract deposits. And in today's world, they're flying out of the banks. So all of those, if we had a system where we got, sovereign money issued right from the Fed into the guts of the NIB, fine, then we'll use that too, So I think that there's lots of, we already have, the legislation already calls for the NIB to have an account with the Fed, and that could be used. So if any of those things come along later in time, we can use them. So I really appreciate your offer. And we always I do a monthly newsletter on the economy and on infrastructure. Anybody that would like to get my newsletter, I have a summary of what trying to connect the dots on how I see, things being related to each other in the economy on a monthly basis. You can, if you want to get on that newsletter, you can send it to me, amuttardy@gmail.com, or you can go on to our website and sign up to be, also a contributor to the grassroots campaign to get your members of Congress to get the bill passed. As Andy said, the big ticket item is here. I don't want one of those dams to go, like went in North Africa and killed 11,000 people. I don't want any other utilities to catch on fire and burn a whole island down. I don't want any more children to be poisoned. This is really stat. We really need to, this is really stat, and it will help do our overall objective, which is equitable economic growth and getting our economy back on track and our international competitiveness. So altogether, it's something we're really pushing. I'm glad you think that the legislation is passable. But that's the kind of with the way that it's configured so that it'll please everyone. It's not going to threaten anyone. There'll be plenty of business left over for the commercial banks. They'll still be able to do their municipal bonds. Nobody that's the head of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee will have his turf go away, because it'll still continue federal funding for grants money for the base part of the financing. And this will come along and complement everything on the top and make sure that we can fix things right away.
Thanks so much.